I'm David Eigel, and this is the David Eigel Show. I'm returning today to revisit the question of the denaming of Dunn Hall. Shortly after the denaming last year, I produced a program questioning the validity of the report and the narrative regarding Professor Dunn. I've since invested a huge amount of work in this project, and I've created a blog called realdunn.blog. It's 53 pages long, and it deals directly with the matter of the report and the actual life of Professor Dunn. What I've learned through extensive research is the report is even worse than I had originally suspected. It is a complete disaster, the authors of which knew neither, well, let's just put it this way. They began their work in ignorance of Professor Dunn and what the Fraternal Order of the Klan was about, and they ended their work in ignorance of Professor Dunn and what the Klan is about. As you might suspect, in those circumstances, they really didn't have a clue as to what the relationship of Professor Dunn and the Fraternal Order of the Klan was. So to understand, I'll start at the beginning. Why do people get so confused on this topic? Well, first, there's a general ignorance of history. And this is a very esoteric area. There's a lot of confusion starting out of the gate. There's not one Klan in American history. There are three major ones. Of course, there are lots of little groups in the last few decades that call themselves the Klan, but they aren't anything substantial. Of the three clans, the first and the third Klan, the post-Civil War Klan and the post-World War II civil rights opponent Klan, were all white supremacists, potentially violent at times, organizations which would harass black people. The second Klan has a quite different story. It's actually a lawful fraternal order. It has some very sordid things in its history, but they're different sordid things than the Klan 1 and the Klan 3. And that's the first analytical problem that people have. They think they know what they're talking about. It's the Klan. They mush all three organizations together, yet each one must be studied separately and understood, especially number 2, the fraternal order. It's a little like comparing an elephant fish, a little elephant fish, with an elephant. They both have the word elephant in their name, and they have a similar looking front, but they're really quite different creatures. And this is an important part of understanding what actually happened in Eugene in 1921 involving the Klan and Professor Dunn. If one listens to what the narrative that the historians have put together, Dunn is leading the local organization. He's the organizer. He is the man in charge, as this organization, according to their story, engages in various forms of harassment and is a part of a greater organization, which is indeed a terrorist organization. And this goes on year after year after year. Well, there are major problems with this, and the worst of these problems is it's simply not true. It never happened. And we know that because there's no record of that ever happening in history. There is something that ties Dunn to this Klan, but the Klan itself is not the violent terrorist organization that the historians said it was. One can look, for example, to Linda Gordon's recent book on the Klan. I, in my blog, realdunn.blog, refer to the late Stanley Coben as dispelling this kind of nonsense that characterizes this as a terrorist organization. One example Linda Gordon's recently come up with is in 1925 in Wichita, Kansas, a local Klan chapter played a benefit game, I believe, with a all-black baseball team, and it was well attended and very peaceful. And just to be extra fair, they had a couple of Catholic umpires to umpire the event. But the point being is that the Klan that we're talking about here is a fraternal order called the Klan. It is not a violent terrorist organization. There is a major problem, and that is the people who are selling it were manipulators, and they were dishonest, and they would misrepresent or change their story as to what their organization was depending on who the audience was. and that could mean different stories even in the same community as to what it was. It was all about making money for them. They might indeed use some kind of vile manipulation at times, or not, depending on who the prospective client was. In Dunn's case, they followed a very typical pattern. Dunn and many other very fine people in Eugene, honorable people, were approached on the basis that they were going to be supporting prohibition. This was their typical approach. They would go after the most prestigious people in the community. They are law and order people, they're patriotic, and law and order in the early 20s meant support for prohibition, because you had all these bootleggers, potential corruption of police and politicians, and the approach was to get these good people in, use their good names, and use that to promote yourself. Some other people in this community who were, for example, were involved and caught up in this were Shy Huntington, who was the star player from the 1917 U of O Rose Bowl team, who later went on to be the U of O football coach. He joined up. I believe the manager of the team also joined up, athletic manager. And you have prestigious ministers, you have different people, very respectable, joining up because they believe they're joining a very respectable organization. And what the record makes very clear is that within a short amount of time, these very people have quit. They dropped out. On a timeline basis, the sales representatives, called Kliegels, came to Eugene in the summer of 1921. 2 months later, there's a national expose talking about corruption involving Ed Clark and Bessie Tyler, the two promoters from the Southern Publicity Association, who had in the summer of 1920 worked out an arrangement with the founder of the very small clan, fraternal order clan, Simmons, where they would get he would get 20 cents of every dollar, they would get 80 cents, and they sent out promotional salesmen up to, from my understanding, is 1,000 to 2,000 of them across the country, and that's why the membership exploded. It really was just a money-making con game. The main thing it seemed to do was to sell memberships, and they did that because that's how the people running it made money. So 2 months after they arrive in Eugene, there's this national expose, and by 6 months later, they are saying they've gone into, they didn't do it originally, but then they went into an all anti-Catholic mode with stories of bizarre conducts. The Pope was going to take over America, it's all a part of that, and erotic stories of priests abusing nuns, this type of thing. But this didn't start till 6 months later. But we know that thanks to Harry Crane, the news reporter for the Salem Capital Journal, who wrote a series in the fall of 1922 about what happened. He described what happened in Eugene and also all around the state. So we know that they've gone anti-Catholic by January of 1922. What did it mean to be anti-Catholic in Eugene, Oregon, according to the Klan? Well, it meant that they were saying that almost all the students at the University of Oregon and the faculty were Catholic. In reality, it was less than 10%, respectively. In addition to that, the University of Oregon was run by secret Jesuit priests. So, if you understand what's actually being said, the whole thing is a farce. We're supposed to believe that this very fine, distinguished man, who's a classics department chair, goes around the Eugene, Springfield community for years, hustling people for money with bizarre fake stories about the university. It's run by secret Jesuit priests, and of course there must have implicitly been secret nuns who were a part of the University of Oregon. And amazingly, no one ever mentions this. There's no record of this at all. So what is there a record of it? How did the historians screw things up so much? There's 4 pieces of evidence that tie Dunn to the Klan. They are a membership list that came out of the headquarters for the region in Los Angeles as a result of a criminal investigation. There was a second list that was found dropped in the summer of 1922 at a meeting on a hill. There is a Kleagle list, and Dunn's name is listed as a Kleagle for Eugene, Oregon. And there's also, the fourth piece is a letter from a dean, Henry Sheldon, who's writing to someone in Wisconsin about how, well, all the silliness about the whole place is run by secret Jesuit priests, and he makes a reference, I hear Dunn is a member, or is the president of the thing, and he's in charge. So he just says, I hear that. Well, this letter from the dean was written in the summer of May of 1922. So according to the historian's report, this is now a much smaller place. There's maybe 150 faculty. Professor Dunn has been running around as organizing, in charge of an organization all year long, and to manipulate people in the community. It's claiming that the U of O is run by secret Jesuit priests, and all the student body is Catholic. Wait a minute. Why aren't people talking about it? Why does no one ever talk to Dunn about this? Well, there's a very good reason. The reason no one's ever recorded talking about to Dunn, or Dunn said this, or whatever, is because this story that was made up never occurred in history. What the evidence actually shows is this very busy man, Frederick Dunn, was hit on because of his prestige. His involvement had nothing to do with racism. We know from the sales pitch, which varied from community to community in Eugene, is that white racism or white superiority or whatever was not part of their sales pitch. It was initially, we're a patriotic, we're a fraternal organization, and we're going to be supporting, in effect, prohibition and against government corruption. So they draw in an initial group of people. But in turn, time passes, and all these people leave. Almost everyone. I've checked the name list. The indications are basically everybody leaves fairly quickly. And from some of the other readings I've had, that's pretty typical. There was a lot of heavy turnover in this organization, and its goal was just to get people in and get their money. The other thing that you have to understand about the history of the Klan in Oregon is its activity was not racially oriented. We had maybe a little more than 2,000 blacks in the state in the early 20s. People weren't joining a fraternal order to deal with people who basically weren't there. What the Klan did do is went into a program of anti-Catholicism, and that program got them involved in politics and in terms of supporting an initiative to, well, it didn't literally say close down the Catholic schools. It was called the Compulsory Education Bill. The idea is everyone will go to the same public schools. So indirectly it would shut down the Catholic schools. Now the Klan, how would the Klan make money? Well, they make money on this because they're crooks. And they would arrange to collect money for the political activities, whether it's the support of a candidate or a recount in an election, or just for the whole program that they're pushing. There would be special assessments. Well, the people running the organization then arranged so that a lot of that money went in their own pockets and not for the cause that they claimed it was. So when we examine what the historians did and didn't do, we see they really missed the boat. For example, they make the claim that we know that he was running this organization for years. In fact, it's fairly safe to say in any real sense he never ran the organization. He had an honorific title. He was a very busy man. He was the head of a classic department. He taught. He was working on writing material. He gave popular lectures on the phallic and solar gods. He was involved with the Masons, the Elks, and very active in church life. So when a new fraternal order showed up and signed him up, he wouldn't have had very much time to be involved with them at all. However, the people who in fact were running things, the Kleagles, they were the people who had a financial interest in running things. Until a chapter got its permanent status, they were able to get a lot of money sucked out from the membership dues for themselves that went in their own pockets. And as a result, in communities across America, in that early period, they did exactly that. They maintained control and did not have the permanent status and ended up pocketing all this money in fees. It was their full-time job. Now, another important area of understanding is the historians, as I say, have claimed that Dunn is running this place. Now, where is their evidence? They cite to a book, and when you check the book, it's called Peculiar Paradise. There isn't any connection to Dunn. It doesn't support their contention. Dunn isn't even mentioned in the book. And if you look at the 4 pieces of evidence that exist, they only relate to the first year. So the historians have made claims that they cannot back up. How did the historians go about analyzing Dunn? Well, my analysis of Dunn showed that he was not only not a racist, but he's a racial progressive. He had actually lived a life of racial integration when he was back in Cambridge, attending Harvard University. And that's because he was a member of the Methodist Episcopal Church of the time, as opposed to the Methodist Episcopal South Church. The Methodists had split up prior to the Civil War, and the Methodist Episcopal, not the Methodist Episcopal South, was the group who had been opposed to slavery, who had worked to establish the Freedmen's Bureau in the period after the Civil War, and had been proponents of the rights of minorities, the rights of, shall we say, the little people. In other words, the base of their religion called for them to show respect to everyone in society, regardless of what their station was. So, not only that, but Dunn was associated with the YMCA, which is noted for being racially progressive and very, very ecumenical in its nature. So how did the historians manage to come up with the idea that this man was a white racist supremacist? Well, that's rather interesting. Their proof comes from a form. They said, they totally ignored the man's actual life. The very things I've just brought up, the importance of his religion and his orientation, in this respect, they completely ignore. It's completely ignored. They don't even address it as it's a major issue. When I was speaking to a member of the clergy of the Methodist Church about this, because from my readings it was, well, this doesn't make sense. How would it be that someone was a Methodist Episcopal member and at the same time is a white supremacist? It's a little like somebody's a white who's a member of the NAACP who's a white supremacist. Well, strange things happen in history, but when they're brought to the fore, they need to be addressed, and the historians never address this. Their entire analysis of Dunn's view of life was based on a blank form, not a filled out form, but a blank one. And they said, we know that because of that form, which talked about white supremacy, we know that this man Dunn is a white supremacist. In fact, he must have encouraged other people. In other words, he's promoting the organization. But there again, they misunderstood their topic because Dunn, despite having an honorific title, was not out peddling memberships to people, in fact. So their reasoning falls apart, and what's particularly embarrassing to them is, see, had the form been genuine, no, the crooked Kliegels would never have shown him a form like that, not to a member of Dunn's church. So we know that didn't happen, and it's inconsistent with his belief system. But what makes it really egregious is that the form that they're saying, and this shows it, this proves it, this form was from a different organization that didn't come into existence for another 4 or 5 years. So that's their entire case. That was it. That was everything that they presented on analyzing Dunn's views. And it was a blank form that they insisted that he had been shown, and he was probably promoting to other people. And he could not have done that because the form didn't exist. It's a different organization that came into existence 4 or 5 years later. So their whole analysis is just really shabby and falls apart. It really is an embarrassment. They've totally misrepresented this man, his life, and what he did or didn't do. Now, I have found the conduct of the president of the University of Oregon, Michael Schill, to be very bizarre from the beginning. As it happened, I had some background in this area prior to the report being issued, and I was eagerly awaiting it. So I read it on, I believe it was a Thursday it came out. I read it, and I was troubled by it, and within 10 minutes of reading it, I started checking and noticed the religious affiliation and began suspecting what I realized it was, is whatever this organization was, it was his involvement probably related to prohibition, which turned out to be exactly right. So the very next day, Michael Schill addressed a group I was a member of, and he said, oh, if you tell me your reactions, just respond on the website. So I did, and I warned him that this is very problematic, offered to share research I'd done, and the net effect was I never heard from him. And he announced he wanted to have Dunn Hall renamed. So I did a lot more research, wrote things up, got it to him 2 and 1 days respectively before the meeting on denaming, and I also sent some information over to the trustees, but he had his information 1 and 2 days prior, and I called, and the secretary says, yeah, he's got it. So yeah, I knew he'd had it, and there was no mention of this, and he went ahead with the denaming. And I had talked to trustee Geneva Ralph the week prior to the denaming and told her there were problems with the report. She said, oh, I look forward to reading it. And after the denaming, I said, what's going on? And her response was, well, there was just so much, and we weren't given the materials till like 7 minutes before the meeting. So it's like we couldn't read through it. Now, why someone would go ahead and vote to dename without examining their facts, I don't know. But that's exactly what happened. Now, the building was denamed. I subsequently produced a TV show, wrote an editorial for the Register Guard, and never heard from anyone. So my subsequent acts were to get copies of For the Kingdom and the Power, which explains the big money swindle that spread hate across America. It explains what was going on with the marketing to each of the, or 2 of the 3 historians, David Johnson and Marshall Wiesiger, here on the U of O campus. And I also went to see, a little after Thanksgiving a year ago, Marshall Wiesiger at her office, and we only had time for a little short exchange. But during that period, I posed a rather obvious question to my mind is, if your story were true, how is it possible that in 1962, Dunn was ever allowed to be honored with this building name? And her response was, oh, that was a long time ago, which made absolutely no sense to me. If it was a long time ago, people are being honored for what they did or didn't do, and had this story been true, this would have been the biggest thing in this guy's life. So I got no explanation there. And I also hit her with a question, well, do you think Professor Dunn was going around telling people that the U of O was run by secret Jesuit priests? And she said, oh, you have evidence of that? And I go, yeah. And she said, well, can you send it to me? And I didn't laugh in her face, but I did send it to her, because that information is a part of one of the 4 pieces of evidence, the only 4 things that link Dunn to the Klan. So she wasn't even cognizant of something that she should have been very cognizant of. I could go on, but suffice to say the scholarship that went into that report is a disaster. In my blog, realdunn.blog, I just tear so much of what they say apart and demonstrate that it's not good scholarship. There is absolutely no chance whatsoever that that report that was used to dename Dunn Hall could possibly be correct. It just falls apart time after time after time. Let's go back to 1962 when Dunn's honored. Now, according to the story, everybody knows about Dunn and what's happened. Yet for 70 years, or at that point it's 70 years, nobody's ever mentioned this story about Dunn leading the Klan. It's not mentioned, and yet everyone was supposed to know it, and he's supposed to be honored in 1962. Well, let's examine some of the people who were here in 1962. Arthur Fleming was the president. Well, I believe while still president of the university, he became chairman of the National Council of Churches, the most ecumenical group in America. This is a man, Arthur Fleming, was going to say, oh yes, if the story in the report were true, yes, a racist, Catholic baiting bigot. Yeah, we should definitely honor him. Not only that, a few years later, after leaving the presidency of the University of Oregon, Arthur Fleming became chairman of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. This is a man who's going to go along with honoring somebody like the Dunn of the report? I don't think so. I think I would give that a 0% chance of success. Let's ask some more. There was harassment of Catholics, so what about Len Casanova, the football coach? He was noted for being very religious, and he was a member of St. Mary's Catholic Church. And hey, why would he think that was okay? This would have been infamous, this man. Yet, Len Casanova never objects. Well, the reason why is because the story isn't true. It never happened. Let's look at another couple of people. 1962, special year. 1959, a man named Phil Knight graduated from the U of O. Now, in reality, in 1962, anybody who's described as Professor Dunn is in that report would never have been able to be honored. It would have been out. People in the community would have been outraged by even the suggestion of such a thing. Two of the people who were here in 62 were Bill Bowerman, was the famous track coach who helped build up Oregon as a famous track school, and his former track team member, Phil Knight, formed their agreement to go and do business together, distributing shoes. So neither of those two gentlemen ever objected. I wonder if, so I guess according to Mr. Schill's view of the world, that they didn't object, so they must have thought that kind of behavior was fine. So I guess in Michael Schill's point of view, Phil Knight's a bigot. Of course, that's not true, but that's the implications of Mr. Schill's supporting this crackpot Dunn report. When one actually understands what this report says and what's actually going on, it becomes ripe material for satire. I do a little of this in my report because everybody in the community knows what Dunn's up to, or would have known, and he's going around hustling people for money, claiming that the U of O is running by secret Jesuit priests. Okay, and he uses Catholic bigotry, so he can do what Harry Crane calls take advantage of the lesser lights of the community, the not so brights. So Dunn does this year after year, and nobody ever complains or comments on it. So I just kind of imagine what's going on. Dunn walks around the community, and people say, "Hey, how's it going, Dunn? How many did you hustle this week?" "Oh, just a couple, but with the upcoming campaign, I'm going to really be able to squeeze a lot of money out of these suckers." This is the distinguished head of the classics department. I really don't think that happened. But this is a problem when you get people writing history that don't know what they're talking about. The image that Mr. Schill projected to the community, oh, these are prestigious historians, and there's 3 of them. Yeah, he got 3 people, none of whom knew what they were talking about, and then he proceeded to, milk the report. In other words, why did he now, after finding out that things were not what he thought, take action? Well, he pandered to a group on campus, and he's using this for self-promotion. He's written letters now to the New York Times talking about his accomplishment. This is an accomplishment in Mr. Schill's mind, having smeared a good man's reputation, and he hasn't owned up to it. I presented my work to the trustees immediately before they renamed Dunn Hall, the former Dunn Hall, Unthank Hall, and frankly, Mr. Schill kind of looked like he liked to crawl under a rug. But his trustees left him alone, and the press didn't pick up on it. And so he's continuing to praise himself for what he's done, a rather slimy thing. Professor Dunn's family are offended, some are, I know of. The Methodist Church, here in town has been insulted. Dunn wasn't just a devout member of this organization. He was an honored member. His portrait hung in their Heritage Hall for generations. And so to ascribe these types of foul activities implicitly to them is rather sad. This is a state university, and it really should be a place where people are trying to search for the truth and can communicate openly and honestly. And what Mr. Schill has done is quite literally an attack on a religious group, and it has racial overtones as well, I feel. There's a mindset that's not very pretty out there, that it's okay, as someone posted on a website related to this matter, in terms of my defense of Dunn, oh, who cares about what some dead white man did? And one of the responses was, 6 months later, I do. He was a good man. He was my great-grandfather. I think it's time for this matter to be cleared up. The U of O trustees can name buildings whatever they like, and that's their business. But the university is supposed to be a place where we can honestly learn about our own history, our own heritage. And in this case, you've got this man Schill coming in here from outside, who quite frankly reminds me of the crooked Kliegels. Yeah, that's right, the crooked Kliegels who come to town and try to manipulate people. He's known what he did, and he hasn't owned up to it, far from it. He's continuing to try and claim credit for himself as his accomplishment. Well, I don't think misleading people about their heritage is a good idea. And I don't really think it's a good idea to tell young minority students, oh yeah, in 1921, these people hated you. You were hated here. And it's not true. And then not only that, 40 years later, who is being honored? Why, the people are in 62. Honored these people. Honored this man. That didn't happen. It's sheer nonsense. If you want to see a very sad thing, I mentioned I've written a great deal about this in my blog, realdunn.blog. But under my name, David Eigel, IGL, on YouTube, I have a copy, which is no longer on the U of O's trustees web page, of the denaming meeting. And in it, it is really, really a freak show. The student body president and the external vice president both speak and say a number of very ridiculous things. Student body president made things up. I could go on satirizing it, but suffice to say, for example, she says the building should be denamed because in 2016 some white supremacist had killed some man for just the crime of being black up or outside Portland. Well, Professor Dunn died in 1937. I don't really think he was involved, and I didn't feel that way, and I still don't feel that. Just absolute nonsense. She started talking about how he'd spent a significant part of his life harassing the blacks and Catholics in Southern Oregon. Well, the report doesn't even say that. She just made it up. It's just, I could go on, but for now I just want to call your attention to that. And President Schill totally screws his facts up. He turns to his trustees and says there's the Klan was one of the most terrible organizations in American history. It wasn't one, it was 3 separate organizations. And he's falsely associating the second one with the conduct of the first and the third, which is quite different. He made statements to the effect that it had lynched Catholics and Jews and blacks. Well, no. None of the Klans lynched lynched Catholics or Jews, and the Fraternal Order as an organization didn't lynch anyone. So he was just making stuff up in talking to his trustees. And that's pretty sorry, to see something like that where the university president is facing his trustees and doesn't know what he's talking about, or apparently doesn't care. And one other embarrassing thing is he said, now, I got the historians in, and I just wanted them to act as historians, not to make decisions on denaming. In February, the following February, Marcia Wiesinger, after a talk, said, in terms of Schill, He tried to get me to make the decision as to dename him, but I told him no, that's why he gets the big bucks. Well, I don't think we're ever going to open up a dictionary and see the word integrity and then Michael Schill's picture there.